Hey everybody, it's Albert. I'll be speaking on this video on a subject I haven't touched on in a while, and that's King James onlyism. Recently, there was a debate held. It was on a British TV program, but it was also broadcast live over the internet between James White, who's a critic of King James onlyism, and Jack Moorman, who is a proponent of King James onlyism. And it was very interesting. And I want to first thank the user SeanPayne.net who recorded it from his PC and has uploaded the video of the broadcast. Now, I had seen the broadcast live, at least a good part of it. I saw that I didn't see all of the question and answer session later, but I saw the two participants' own opening statements, and I thought it made things pretty clear. Now, I think there were problems with but the problems weren't with the participants. I think it was with the format, because what happened is they each were given 20-minute opening statements, and they basically those things will be done prior to ever hearing the other person. They're canned statements, more or less. This is what we're going to say. What would have been better is if they were then each given a 10-minute rebuttal period, but that wasn't available, because then they could respond to each other. So basically what you got were them rebutting things in the context of questions that were supplied by the audience later, but that really didn't have very much in the way of cohesiveness. And it's always a problem, I think, with debates when you have audience participation, although a lot of people, they want to be part of it, and I can understand from a popular level, it really, because not everyone is uniformly asked good questions, or sometimes they use it as questions as a platform for inserting themselves into the debate with their own idiosyncratic views, and it really takes away from the debate itself. I think it's better when it's left strictly to participants, and they have rebuttal periods, and then they have chance to ask each other questions, and then closing remarks. I think that standard, which is your standard debate format, I think works a lot better than when they start bringing the audience in to ask questions, and because it really isn't much of a debate at all at that point. It's more people from each side trying to attack the person on the other side, and it really doesn't add much to the conversation. But that being said, you do have their opening remarks. Now, as I mentioned, there really wasn't that much interaction with each other's opening remarks, and I think that the problem, because the questions weren't always that good, I think that ends up being part of the problem. I do think that White was decidedly better in both the opening statement, but that could be a matter of people. Not everyone is going to know reality. Not everyone's going to know the history, so it's more of a he said, that, who knows who's telling the truth here. But they weren't able to interact with each other to point out the weaknesses in the other person, so that I think that presents the real problem here. So what I'm going to do is actually take Jack Moorman's opening statement and analyze it, and just to point out that there's a lot of it's typical King James only bluster, but there are just things in there that are just not true, and any examination of the evidence will point it out, and a lot of assumptions made that simply don't hold up once you give it even the slightest bit of examination. So I'm going to go through his opening statement and then make comments as we go along. Anyone's free to do the same thing on the other side with James White's statement, but I want to do this so people can point out I just want to point out the fallacies in this point of view, and why people just generally don't take it seriously. There's a lot of bluster available. Now, Moorman's certainly not the worst of them. I mean, he's not a Ruckmanite of any sort, but still, there's a lot of things in there that just aren't accurate, and I just want to go through them, and I'll make comments as we move along.
So, without further ado, Jack, I want to give you the first 20 minutes to present your case for the King James Version.
Well, certainly, thank you very much tonight. And again, as it's been mentioned, when an edition of the Bible has become a 400-year standard, that is certainly quite a matter of wonder and a case for reflection, and especially so when that Bible is still widely used, and especially so when the language of that Bible, though different, is not difficult.
There are three basic arguments he makes here, and I'm going to take each of them in turn. First, it was used for over 400 years. Whoopee. I mean, honestly, this is not an argument. It has nothing to do with its accuracy. It's how close it was to the original text. It has nothing to do with that. It makes no case for it. Unless you were able to prove it was used in the first 400 years of Christianity, which certainly was not the case. The fact is, it was the Bible of the Church of England beginning in 1611. That's 16 centuries after the fact or so. So this is just a bad argument. And I could also point out that the things like the Latin Vulgate were in use they were the dominant Bible for many more centuries than the King James Version was. And in the Greek-speaking East, the Byzantine text, which is not the same as the King James or the Textus Receptus, was used for many more centuries than the King James Version. The Aramaic Peshitta was used in the Church of the East for many more. On and on. You can go down the list. These are not, why aren't these considered? And basically what this points out to is the general parochialism of King James onlyism. It comes down to God really loves white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Because apparently they were the only ones he entrusted with his perfect word in the entire history of Christianity, which tells you something, the mindset of these people. It's just, that argument is just so silly. I find it difficult to understand how people can actually make it with a straight face, but you saw it with your own eyes there. Next, he goes on to state that that it was still widely used today. Well, the fact is no one's suggesting people not use it, really. And here's the hypocrisy of King James onlyists. They're constantly complaining about, they're trying to make us use. No one's making them use. You can freely get the King James Bible anywhere. It's in a million places online. No one's stopping them from using the King James Bible, honestly. But it is King James onlyists who basically drummed up this campaign to try to stop people from using other Bibles and condemn them as satanic. And it's this level of silliness and double standards and just hypocrisy that makes King James onlyists that basically moves them into the fringes. If they prefer the King James Bible, that's fine. I have no objection to them using it. But it's their own. They're the ones who are sowing divisiveness, and not everyone else. And the fact is, the evidence is not on their side. Even if they want to make the case, they can try and make the case the King James Bible is perfect, but it just doesn't hold up. And as we'll see as we move along. And then finally, he makes it, it's not difficult to understand. Well, that's, of course, in the eye or ear of the beholder. Now, it's not difficult for me to understand, but I imagine I know people for whom it's very difficult to understand. And it just leaves them cold, and they get nothing out of it, really. They don't understand it. And it's not, and I would point out, it's not just merely a matter of archaic words. We're adding ETH onto the end of verbs or something like that. There are words in the King James Bible that are still used today, but the meaning is totally different. So someone can read it and totally misinterpret the passage, and it happens all the time. Even among, I see King James onlyists misinterpreting what they're reading because they don't understand, certain words don't mean the same thing then as they do now. I see it happen. But, they will. So obviously, it can be difficult to understand. It really can be, and but even if it weren't, again, that's not an argument. That is really not an argument for its accuracy. So right here, we don't really have anything of substance. So let's move on.
The King James Version was always different. It was never current. It was never contemporary. It was never like your morning newspaper. It was always a step up. It was not Elizabethan.
This is, again, a really vacuous argument that has nothing to do with its accuracy. First of all, he's trying to defend it against it being archaic by saying, oh, it was never really with the times or anything. Well, obviously, it was not necessarily common language, but it was certainly much more understandable in 1611 than it is now. Most people would have perfectly understood what it meant in 1611. You wouldn't have the confusion you had now. He mentions it was not Elizabethan. Well, of course it wasn't. It was pre-Elizabethan, actually. The Elizabethan age would begin in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, somewhere in the mid-17th century. This is half a century before that. So saying it's not Elizabethan, of course, he doesn't tell you it's actually pre-Elizabethan. And the whole argument here that he mentions it was always a step above. Well, let me explain something here. Obviously, the King James Bible is a translation. In fact, that's what the translators called it, a translator's preface, because it was a translation. There's something they believed was the accurate text in Greek, and they were translating it. Well, the problem is that if you translate something into a higher form in its destination language, into, let's say, a more refined form than it was in its source language, Greek, are you not, in a sense, distorting the message in some way? Would it not? I mean, certainly you don't want to dumb it down either, which some versions have done, but you want to have it reflect accurate. If you want it to reflect accurately the way it was written in the original language in Greek, once you have the text that you deem to be as accurate, an accurate rendering of that in Greek, then you need to maintain it at the same level as closely as you can in its destination language, in this case English. So to make it a step above, if you're making it a higher form of the language than it originally was in Greek, or Hebrew, then you are in fact distorting it, and that's something that Moorman has apparently missed.
The King James Version is a 400-year standard. That is a matter for great reflection. With a standard, you know where you stand. With a constant flow of modern versions and revisions of these versions, you're not so certain where you stand. The footing is not so secure. It's more tentative. It's more provisional. It's not quite as nailed down.
Here, Moorman is discussing the recent glut of new versions, and I want to make it clear that those who are not King James onlyists are not necessarily defending every single modern translation. A lot of them are just frankly garbage. But in a free country, you're going to be free to come up with Bible translations if you have freedom of the press. That's sort of one of the unfortunate byproducts, but I'd rather have it that way than the other way, which I'll get into in a moment. Because see, there's a little bit of historical revisionism going on here. In fact, there was a bit of a glut of versions at the time that the King James Bible was released, which he sort of ignores, that when the King James Bible came out, it was one more version among many versions. And what one of the goals of King James to unite the British Isles, Scott, remember he was originally King of Scotland, then became King of Scotland and England. And one of the things, he was trying to unite them under one king, one faith, one church, etc. And one of the things he wanted was one Bible. And that was one of the purposes of the King James Version. There was a lot of different Bibles in use. Particularly, the most popular one at the time was the Geneva Bible among the Puritans. And the way that this eventually played out was that the British Crown banned the printing of any other Bible but the King James Bible. And then eventually, even because a lot of Puritans were still importing copies of the Geneva Bible that they printed elsewhere, they banned the importation of any Bible in English apart from the King James Bible. So he sort of ignores that fact. Now, if he would like us down to one version, I suppose you could have the government impose a. Is that what he's suggesting? That we could always go back to some sort of theocracy with the government imposing, say, the English Standard Version as the one true Bible, and all others are not allowed to be printed. But I don't think he really would want that either. You see, he's making it sound as though this sort of rush to the King James Bible as the one Bible was something that happened organically, and in fact it wasn't the case. It was something enforced by the Crown. And then eventually, as Great Britain became a major empire, that's the one Bible that went with it around the world, and that's how it came to prominence. But this historical revisionism doesn't really wash once you actually look at the facts.
This evening, I want to show that the Authorized Version prepared during the years 1604 to 1611 is fundamentally superior to the modern versions. And I emphasize the term fundamentally because whilst there are many issues involved here, there is one great Mount Impassable issue that, with respect, I do not believe my friends who use the modern versions can adequately address this issue. If you can see this issue, and if you can see the major issues, I do think that the secondary issues begin to fall into line.
I'm not going to comment directly at the moment, but I want to point out this Mount Impassable issue. See, this is the thing that sort of got my curiosity when I was watching the debate the first time. I was wondering, what is going to be his Mount Impassable issue? And when it finally came up later in his presentation, I was stunned because, well, this has been addressed thousands of times, including even by me on YouTube videos. It's fairly common knowledge. And to claim that this has not been addressed just displays complete willful ignorance. This guy really has to, I can't believe he actually said this with a straight face, but you'll have to wait until we get there, so let's just move on.
My first main point is I propose that the King James Version is a very accurate translation of the Greek and Hebrew words which God inspired in the beginning.
Of course, stating something and proving something are two entirely different things, but I want you to notice right away in the approach that he's in fact stating that they're an accurate version of what God inspired at the beginning. So one would think then that one should go look for early manuscripts and try to figure out what these texts should be, that in the beginning, right? Okay, so you should go to the early manuscripts and work through them, but that's not really the direction he moves in, as we'll see. So I want you to realize that he's arguing here from the Greek manuscripts. So all the King James only used to say, well, you don't have to pay attention to the Greek. Well, here Moorman's saying yes. So I will give him credit there. Moorman is not a Ruckmanite, okay? And I want I want to be fair here. He's not a Ruckmanite at all. And I'll make that a little clearer in a few minutes. But so it's going to be coming down to an argument about Greek manuscripts. So I want you to keep this in mind, okay? So as we move on.
Number one, that these words were given by inspiration verbally. The faith once delivered, Jude verse 3, there is no secondary inspiration, that these words were preserved verbally. Christ promised in Matthew 24 verse 35, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will not pass away.
There are 2 points I want to bring up in this little section. I realize, again, he's only warming up to his main presentation, but there are 2 things in here that I think need to be addressed. One is, I want to point out, you notice he says there's no double inspiration. At this point, he's definitely separating himself from the Ruckmanite wing of King James onlyism, which believes that the King James Bible translation, or at least some of them believe the King James Bible translation itself was an act of direct inspiration, which frankly is just, that's more in the tinfoil hat territory of King James onlyism, but he's separating himself from those crackpots and trying to just argue from the textual evidence. So I will commend him for that. But when he gets to this whole idea of my word shall not pass away, etc., and you once delivered to the saints. The faith is once delivered to the saints, but the idea that at some point it could never happen that words in the Bible might be changed. Now, I'd be more concerned if actual key doctrines were changed in the Bible, but that really hasn't happened. But that individual words might not somehow have been in the transmission process altered. When he says my word shall not pass away, that doesn't mean that in some copies they might not be distorted a little bit, or that they might not be said exactly, because let's face facts, Jesus probably wasn't speaking to his disciples in Greek. He was more likely speaking to them in Aramaic. So just the fact that they're now in Greek means they're not exactly what he said, because what he said was in a different language. So the idea that you have to have these are the exact utterances of Jesus is just simply impossible, given the fact that the document itself is in Greek. It's so, right away there are issues with this whole, these are that's not the way the New Testament has come down to us. You're simply not dealing with the realities of the situation. That, in fact, his words are a translation to begin with, that what we have. So that doesn't, but the main point is that when he says, my word shall not pass away, it's the content of the message, not necessarily the exact utterances that came from his mouth, because they were in a different language. So this assumption takes into it certain things that really aren't necessarily the case. But I just want to point that out before we move on any further.
Number 3, that Christ further promised that the Holy Spirit would guide believers into all truth concerning these words. John 16:13 compared with verses like John 17, verse 17.
There's a couple of things in this little excerpt I want to bring up, but I realize again that he's merely warming up to his presentation. But there are a few things I think need to be addressed. One is, to his credit, I want you to notice he mentioned there's no double inspiration. This is in fact separating himself from the Peter Ruckman end of King James onlyism, which believes the translation of the King James Bible itself was divinely inspired, and in fact that it goes through the 7 purifications. It's a very strange, and frankly, that's a good sign that he's separating himself from the wingnuts of King James onlyism, because that really that sort of crackpot's idea, and he's trying to deal with textual evidence. The problem is he has real problems, and this comes to the other thing I'm going to address in this little clip, is when he speaks, when he uses things like my word shall not pass away, or the Holy Spirit will lead us to all truth. He doesn't really say what those things mean, or at least he seems to be implying that they mean that the Bible will, in fact, the exact words as written should be there at all times. Well, there are things in the King James Bible that weren't there in earlier centuries. Why is it somehow the 17th century that this only applies to this apparently the 17th century, because you don't see it earlier than that. There's things in the King James Bible that don't predate, say, Stephanus, like Revelation 16:5, but you don't find it in any manuscript anywhere prior to the 17th century, or prior to Stephanus in the 16th century. So what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that God really didn't care about previous centuries? Or only, the West and not the East, or things like the Comma Johanneum, which appear in no Greek manuscripts until very, very late. What does that mean? He's not consistent, and this is the problem. He sort of freezes on this period around 1611 as though that represents everything that came before, and it's not true. And this is a real problem, because and you'll see it come up again and again throughout his presentation, where he tries to present the King James Bible as representing all that came before, and it just isn't true, and we'll get to that as we move along.
And then number 4, that these preserved Greek and Hebrew words would not be difficult to find across the centuries. Deuteronomy 30, verse 14, the word is very nigh thee. These words would not be hidden in a desert. These words, like Codex Vaticanus, would not be hidden in the Vatican Library. These words, like Codex Sinaiticus, would not be found near a waste paper bin in a Greek Orthodox monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. These words would not be out there somewhere, but we're just not certain where they are.
Here we see the complete double standards of King James onlyism on full display. Because it's first he's talking about the preserved Greek and Hebrew words. Okay? Well, first of all, let's deal specifically, let's say, with the Greek word, the New Testament. What we're talking about in terms of the New Testament is less than 2% of the text. So let's start there. So it's not as though these are vastly different texts. Okay, so that's just in 98%, over 98% are in complete agreement. There's less than 2% which the various texts will disagree. So, where the various streams will generally disagree. So let's start there. And he sort of makes it sound as it's a much bigger difference than it actually is. But it's still a difference. But you notice he says we shouldn't have to find these in obscure places, etc., etc. Well, that applies to stuff in the King James Bible as well. Where, for example, did one find in any of these preserved Greek texts the Comma Johanneum prior to the time of Erasmus? In fact, Erasmus certainly couldn't find it, neither could anybody else. In fact, all of the texts that are produced that have the Comma Johanneum in it, Greek texts, come from the time of Erasmus or later. None of the Greek texts preserve that. And since he's talking about the preserved Greek words, well, where are they? Where's the Comma Johanneum in a Greek text? Now, it does appear as a margin note in some earlier texts, but the margin note was added after the time of Erasmus when this became an issue. The text themselves may be earlier, but the margin note was added many centuries later. So again, it's a complete double standard. Where, for example, does one find the reading of Revelation 16:5 that you see in the King James Bible anywhere prior to Stephanus making a conjecture? It doesn't appear in any Greek manuscript anywhere. It just doesn't. So where is it? Obviously you had to go to some obscure. Basically, you had to invent it. It's something that was created at the time of the development of the Textus Receptus and the development of the King James Bible. It didn't appear in these. So the idea that's there are other less, that aren't quite as obvious as those. I mean, for example, you don't find the certain readings until the 7th century, the 9th century, the 11th century, where it only applies. He's assuming everything that appears in either the Textus Receptus or King James Bible in either of those texts was standard before that time, and it simply is not the case. And so obviously this is a complete double standard that he's applying. He's saying, well, you shouldn't have. Well, the fact is, if you find it in much, much earlier texts, that issue has to be addressed. If you don't find certain readings until much later texts, that has to be addressed. You have to say, okay, why does this appear later, etc. And if you can come up with a legitimate reason, that's one thing, but just to simply wave your hands as though this was not an issue is frankly dishonest, or at least being just willfully ignorant.
And then number 5, that these words during the manuscript period would be found in the multiplication of Scripture rather than in their being hidden away. 2 Corinthians 9 verse 10 says, and multiply the word sown, seed sown. Psalms 147:15, his word runneth very swiftly. Psalm 68 verse 11, the Lord gave the word, and great was the company of those that published it.
Couple things I would address here. First of all, at the end he quotes a couple of Bible verses as if giving a single verse without any context, any exegesis, means anything. It doesn't. And in fact, if you go look at those particular verses in their context, they don't have anything at all to do with what the topic of conversation is here. They just have nothing to do with it. So as far as I'm concerned, all of that's insubstantial. And this applies to just about every verse he quotes, as far as I can see. So I'm not going to really deal much with that anymore. But more importantly, let's deal with this whole issue of multiplication, as if somehow this sheer volume means something. Well, it would mean something, for example, I would be impressed if you could show me throughout all the time periods of the church that this, in fact, was the dominant readings. There was a consistency here, because after all, he's saying the word will be preserved. Well, if it's preserved, it's got to be preserved in every century. But you don't find that. Those readings, a lot of his readings, you don't find them in earlier centuries. They show up the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, some show up in the 16th. I mean, you can't make this argument consistently. And that's why they have to run all over. There's no consistent methodology here. The fact is, if you wanted to look for the best readings, you would go certainly in the first 9 centuries of the church. And I'm saying 9 because that gives enough time to have the Byzantine there. If you want to argue, let's use the Byzantine text from that period, that's one thing, okay? We can argue about that. But to somehow say the volume of all the texts, since, let's say, for example, the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, either one of those centuries, the volume of manuscripts from those periods is much larger than anything that comes in the first 9 centuries. In fact, the entire first 9 centuries together. So obviously, if you're just going on a strictly number basis, it's a distortion because it's heavily weighted to later manuscripts, which just generally are going to be less accurate because of the transmission process, that things are more likely to get changed the longer you wait. So you should be looking in terms of earlier manuscripts, and let's say the first 9 centuries. Go look there, and we can argue about things. But to start simply go on this basis of numbers, when in fact you know that the numbers are skewed. The other thing he doesn't really address here is the facts of history. Why are they skewed in this one direction? He treats it as though this is somehow in itself evidence, and it isn't, because what happens is you would certainly have different readings in different locations. But what happens is in other locations, the manuscript tradition changes from Greek to something else, and that's not addressed at all. For example, there was a Western readings, but the West switched from Greek to Latin for the New Testament for obvious reasons. That was the more common language in that region. In the areas around, let's say, Egypt and whatever, first you had 2 things happen. One is they split it with the Coptic Church at the Council of Chalcedon, and in what became the Coptic Church, and generally they switched to the more native Coptic rather than sticking with the Greek. And then, of course, you had the invasions, the Muslim invasions, the Islamic invasions in the 6th and 7th century. So you've got issues here that are just simply not addressed, and that's why. And that region stopped using Greek as a language for its New Testament. So the only areas left would have been in what was left of the Byzantine Empire that continued to use Greek, and they basically started mass producing them after the 10th century. A lot of the monasteries they had set up were just churning them out. And what ends up happening is, as the size of the Byzantine Empire was shrinking and shrinking, you're going to get a situation where they're going to conform more and more. There's going to be less variation. And these are the ones that were, in fact, everything became centralized in Constantinople. And that's where you get the whole Byzantine tradition. But all the facts and see, that's the problem. King James onlyism does not stand up to the facts of history. But that's why they just sort of ignore history and come up with these generalizations that may sound good to someone who doesn't understand the particular events that were going on in the time in terms of the ebb and flow of power in that particular era. But when you examine them, they really don't stand up at all.
And then in time, the 47 translators divided into 6 companies, gathering at Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster, would accurately translate these preserved, originally inspired Hebrew and Greek words into the English of the Authorized Version.
While I do commend Pastor Moorman for trying to at least deal with the textual issues, whenever King James onlyists argue from textual issues, they have to misrepresent the text that they're dealing with, because he mentions that they then accurately translated the preserved text. Well, if what he's referring to, as we shall see, is in fact the majority text, the King James Version differs from that in over 1,800 places, as does the Textus Receptus, also differs from in many, many places. But so this isn't that tradition at all. It's something different. It's related, but it's different. So right away, his argument is basically failed immediately. Right at where he starts to really get to the meat of his argument, it fails because what the King James translators came up with is not an accurate translation of that preserved Greek text that we would know as the majority text, the Byzantine text. It isn't. It differs from it in many places. The Byzantine text does not have the Comma Johanneum and many of the other distinctive King James readings. It just isn't there. And also many of the Textus Receptus readings. The Byzantine text just does not have those. So to argue that this somehow is in fact an accurate translation of that is a complete misrepresentation. But this is what has to happen. You simply have to jump from one thing to another and sort of make it sound like, oh, well, we're arguing for this preserved version of the text, when it really isn't the same, because then you would be arguing for something along the lines of the majority text. But that isn't what they argue for. They're arguing for the King James Version. And this is why I said there's no consistent methodology. They're saying we're arguing for the majority text, but when James White challenged him on specific issues where the King James Version is obviously different from the majority text and said, okay, well, you agree we have to change it here, he backed away from that. No, because it's basically, I support the majority text unless the majority text is different from the King James Version. So basically what it comes down to is I support the King James Version and the evidence doesn't really matter, because it's basically I'll make whatever argument I have to preserve, to say the King James Version is perfect, and it doesn't, and the evidence really is secondary to this circular argument that the King James Version is right because the King James Version is right. And that's why those who support the King James onlyism but try to argue from textual evidence simply have to misrepresent the evidence because the evidence doesn't back them up.
My second major point, I propose, as shown by that most remarkable of documents, the Authorized Version preface, known as the Translators to the Readers, that this was likely the most unique gathering of godly scholarship ever. As to the originals from which they translated, they say, the originals thereof being from heaven, not of earth, the author being God, not man, the inditer, the Holy Spirit, not the wit of the apostles or prophets, the scriptures being acknowledged to be so full and so perfect. Unlike biblical scholarship today, these men were not tainted by rationalism, by unbelief, by uncertainty. As to how they approached their work, the preface says, and in what sort did these assemble? In the trust of their own knowledge, and they had knowledge. They were the greatest grammarians in the land. And in what sort did they assemble? In the trust of their own knowledge, or of their sharpness of wit, or deepness of judgment, as it were, in an arm of flesh? At no hand. They trusted in him that hath the key of David, opening and no man shutting. If you ask what they had before them, truly it was the Hebrew text of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New. These are the two golden pipes through which the olive branches empty themselves into the gold. Neither did we think much to consult the translators or commentators, Chaldee, Hebrew, Syrian, Greek, or Latin, nor the Spanish, French, Italian, or Dutch. Neither did we disdain to revise that which we had done, and to bring back to the anvil that which we had hammered. We have at the length, through the good hand of the Lord upon us, brought the work to that pass that you now see.
There's a few things here that need to be addressed, and because it's incredibly misleading again. First of all, with the KJV translator's preface, why doesn't he mention that the KJV translators thought that even their edition had to be updated? Or, they did not think what they had was the final word on the matter. That in fact things would have to change as our understanding of the text and as more information became available. That's not mentioned at all. I would also point out that the KJV translators praised men like Origen and Jerome for their work. They praised the Septuagint and the Vulgate, which the King James onlyists generally treat as anathema. And while we're at it, there's a lot of times you'll hear King James onlyists sort of point out something like, oh, well, you think you're better than these scholars who worked on the King James Version? No, I don't. But that's irrelevant, you see, because knowledge can increase with time. For example, I also don't think I'm better than Isaac Newton, but there's things, as a mathematics major, there are things about physics that I know that Newton didn't, and it had nothing to do with me being smarter than Newton. It had to do with other brilliant people coming up with things subsequent to Newton that he had no way of knowing because of because of technical advances, etc. So that doesn't mean I think I'm better than Newton. It just means that science had advanced to that point. And in this case, the study of the text, the guys who did the King James Version had no knowledge of dating texts like this is from the 5th century or the 8th century or anything. They didn't. It's just ridiculous. They didn't know anything about text types. That wasn't known then. They didn't know anything about the various streams of, the Alexandrian versus the Western versus the Byzantine. They didn't know any of that then. It's ridiculous to even say that they made any decision based on something like that. It's ridiculous. What they had was a very limited number of manuscripts because they were in the Western Church, which had traditionally used Latin for the previous millennia, and they had a very limited number and generally late number of Byzantine manuscripts. Most of the Greek manuscripts were in monasteries in the Eastern Church, and they would not be seen for centuries to come. So this whole argument falls. So I would point that out. Now, the question about biblical scholarship today, yes, there are a lot of non-believers who are biblical scholars. That doesn't mean, however, that every single, and I'm not endorsing every modern translation, neither does anyone else. However, there are lots of there are modern translations that are made by very very believers, that this is a translation by Christians and not by rationalists or anything. So that's just simply nonsense. And it's incredibly misleading, because no one who supports modern scholarship, who supports modern versions, is endorsing every single version out there. It's ridiculous, and just to infer that is highly misleading. And finally, when he speaks again of them having the Hebrew for the Old, they worked with the Hebrew and the Greek of the Old and the New Testaments. Well, again, they're using what they had available. They did not have necessarily the wealth of information we have now, and it has nothing to do with them. Again, it has nothing to do with them being good or bad scholars. I'm the first to acknowledge these guys were absolutely brilliant, but they simply did not have the information we have available now, and it's no more a denigration to them to say that modern scholars have more information available than they did, than it would be to say modern physicists have more information available than Isaac Newton did. Well, it's simply a fact. Now, does that make all modern physicists smarter than Newton? Of course not. But this is the sort of fallacious reasoning that King James onlyists have to appeal to, because the evidence does not support their ideas.
As to their result and conclusion, they say, "Truly, good Christian reader, we never thought from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, nor yet to make of a bad one, in the literary sense, a good one, but to make a good one better, or out of many good ones, one principal good one, not justly to be accepted against. That hath been our endeavor, that hath been our mark. Many other things we might give thee warning of, gentle reader, if we have not exceeded the measure of a preface already. Ye are brought unto fountains of living water, which ye dig not. Do not cast earth into them with the Philistines, neither prefer broken pits, nor tread under foot so precious things, neither yet with Esau sell your birthright for a mess of pottage."
Here again, I would point out, at this point he's just merely reading from the preface, and I have no problem with anything he read. But of course, none of that has to do with the issue here at hand. The King James translators are referring to the Bible itself. They're not comparing their translation, saying that other translations are bad. And they certainly were not saying that you should cease making translations into the future. They don't say anything of the sort. So to use this somehow to defend King James onlyism is incredibly misleading. And I suggest everyone please read the preface, the entire thing in its context, because it does not support King James onlyism. The King James translators were not King James onlyists.
When one disparages a passage in the Authorized Version, it is correct to ask them, how long did you look at that passage before you were prepared to surrender it?
I want you to notice at this point the complete circularity of his argument. All along he's been speaking of the preserved Greek and Hebrew texts, but now he's not talking about the Greek and Hebrew text. When push comes to shove, it's the King James Version above all. What he's done here is, a priori, assume the King James Version is the default position, and even though everything he's argued up to this point would have some form of a Greek and Hebrew text as the default position to be examined. But now he's talking about surrendering the King James reading. Well, that shouldn't be the issue. The issue should be looking at the Greek and Hebrew texts, and then from that deciding what the proper reading is. And if it happens to be the King James reading, fine. And if it happens not to be, fine too. Because the question shouldn't be, are you surrendering the King James reading or the reading from any Bible, but are you surrendering the truth? And it seems for Pastor Moorman, for other King James onlyists, that defending the King James reading is more important than defending the truth. Because, there, as I said, there is no consistent methodology. As much as they might argue, this preserved Greek text or whatever, they don't really care about it. They only use it as long as it supports the King James reading. If it supports a different reading, then they argue against it. And so, as I said before, there simply is no consistent methodology.
My third main point, Mount Impassable. Mount Impassable.
Okay, so now we're finally going to get to the core of his argument, and let's just see how this plays out.
I propose that there is a huge Mount Impassable difference between the Greek text that underlies the Authorized Version and that which underlies the modern versions.
Now let us remember this insurmountable difference, this Mount Impassable, is less than 2% of the New Testament text, but let's hear him out, and I will respond to him point by point.
The Authorized Version text first. I have a copy of it right here. That text first. This text represents the vast majority of the 5,500 Greek manuscripts that we now have. Most of these Greek manuscripts are obviously very much used.
Until now, I've been sort of, for the most part, humoring Pastor Moorman in this response, but now I simply have to call him on this, because there's not any way in the world he could not possibly know this, because, and he acts as though this is, remember, this is his Mount Impassable, the thing that has allegedly never been properly addressed. In fact, it's been addressed hundreds and hundreds of times, thousands of times probably. The problem is that most King James onlyists just simply refuse to deal with the facts. And what's really upsetting here is that there's no way he could not possibly know this. So I really don't know what to say. It seems that he's willing, in his defense of the King James Bible, to sacrifice truth, to sacrifice honesty, to sacrifice his own integrity. And I find that upsetting. It's one thing to be ignorant of something. It's another thing simply to put your head in the sand or to pretend that the answer isn't there. And if he in fact has been debating this issue, if he's involved in this issue, he has to know this. There's no way he could not have been aware of this. This has been addressed hundreds of times. And let me explain one thing. The text notice he never actually identified that. He says, this is the text that represents. He doesn't say what it is. I had no way of knowing. If James White had not, during the debate, pointed this out, I would have had absolutely no way of knowing exactly what text he was referring to. And in fact, what he was referring to was the Scrivener edition. Now, why is that important? Well, the Scrivener edition does not represent the vast majority of manuscripts. It doesn't. It represents a few dozen, maybe. That's about it. And not even those, really. It's kind of approximates those. You see, what's happened with the Scrivener edition, first of all, the Scrivener edition did not even exist at the time of the King James Bible. It came out 3 centuries plus after the King James Bible. There is no preserved Greek text that matches the King James Bible, because the King James Bible didn't use just Greek. The King James Bible used a number of different sources, including various versions of the Textus Receptus by Erasmus, Beza, Stephanus, plus the Latin Vulgate. And it more or less decided between each of those. It did not use that edition. What happened is there is no Greek text that matches the King James Bible, New Testament. There just isn't. What happened is that many centuries later, Scrivener came out with a Greek version, a Greek text that matched the King James Version, but it wasn't the other way around. It was created specifically for the purpose of matching the King James Version. It came out And what happened was Scrivener was trying to provide a service by saying this is the Greek that would match the King James Version, and he tried to pick out what source it was, and if it turns out that some of the stuff wasn't in any Greek source, in fact was more from the Latin Vulgate, then he tried to revert. It was some reverse engineering going on there. So this whole argument that text represents, it isn't. Look, there's something known as the majority text, and it can be defined slightly differently depending on what approach you take. But basically, there is a representation of that particular text type that was in fact the majority one, what you would call the Byzantine text, and you can get editions of them. There's a number of very well-known ones that came out in the last few decades. This is one, the Greek New Testament, according to the majority text. This is by Hodges and Farstad. And then there's the New Testament in the original Greek, the Byzantine text form by Robinson and Pierpont. These two represent the vast majority of the 5,500, not the King James Version, not the Textus Receptus. So that argument is simply bogus. And he knows it's bogus, and this has been pointed out hundreds of times to King James onlyists, thousands of times, and they just ignore it. And to me, that just shows the basic dishonesty of this position, that it really doesn't matter. The Greek text doesn't matter to these people. It really doesn't. They may use, and like if the majority text generally agrees with the King James, it's certainly closer than the Alexandrian text, so they're going to argue that, oh, we represent this, but they don't. There are, in fact, approximately 1,800 differences between the majority text and the King James. So this is just totally bogus. And he knows it's bogus, and this is where I just got to call him on it. This is just absolutely dishonest, and it shows that, in fact, when he's talking about sacrificing the King James, he's sacrificing the truth for the King James. The truth doesn't matter with these people, and this is the classic example. But let's keep going.
This text has 2,900 more words. This text is doctrinally fuller. This text is cohesive. And yet amongst the manuscripts that support this text, there is just enough difference to let you know that they are not lateral copies or reproductions of each other, but they are each individual witnesses representing long lines of transmission into the past. If you were to ask how many are a copy of each other, probably less than 10. Kersop Lake said, regarding those that he looked at, almost all are orphan children. We've got nearly 5,500 manuscripts of the type that underlie the Authorized Version. They're all independent witnesses, not copies of each other. And this text, and let me also add, Gordon Fee asks, he says, but the question still must be answered. How does one account for its dominance and general uniformity? How did the Byzantine text, and that is what one of the names for this text, how did it become dominant? And this text spread widely.
Again, we see a lot more of the same stuff. It's simply misrepresenting things. First of all, the Byzantine text isn't what was used for the King James Version. As I mentioned, that majority text for Byzantine text differs from the King James Version in 1,800 or so places. So this argument just falls apart. If you look at those Byzantine texts, he mentions they're not necessarily direct copies of each other, but in fact all of them are traceable back to a few early Byzantine texts. It's just over the centuries, over the 6 or so centuries, or 7, 8 centuries, there's changes made in the Byzantine text as well. He asks, what about the uniformity? Well, what happens, and what happens with the uniformity is that things became much more centralized after the Constantine rose to power and started the process where Christianity would eventually become the official religion of the empire. Remember, the Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire. That's the church that gave us the Byzantine text, which a lot of fundamentalist Baptists probably don't like to think about it, that basically the process that led to the Byzantine text began with the Emperor Constantine. But in fact, that's what happened. Things became much more centralized as centuries went on, and it led to a uniformity because everything was under the control of the empire. It was official state business to copy Bibles. It wasn't, whereas in previous centuries it had been more or less informal. Now it became a very formal process under the control of the monasteries, and the idea that this text quote spread widely, well, that really isn't the case. What happened is that the Greek language ceased to be the language of Scripture for a good part of what used to be the Christian world. The whole Western Church switched to Latin. As I mentioned, there was the split with the Egyptian Church, where they went to Coptic and various other things. So you had, and as the Byzantine Empire shrunk, you had things centralized in a particular location in Constantinople. So this argument, just from start to finish, is full of holes. And again, even if you prefer this text, and Maurice Robinson has made a case for the Byzantine text, but it has nothing to do with King James onlyism, because the King James Bible doesn't match that text. So if that's the argument you're making, then use one of these, not the King James Version. Translate these guys, but you'll have something different than you'll get with the King James Version.
The second text, our modern version text, which underlies most of the modern Bibles. The modern version text. This text is represented by two very, very old manuscripts, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, dating from about the year 360. It's also supported by not many more than 40 or 50 other manuscripts.
So which is it? Is it 2, or is it 2 plus 40 or 50 others? You can't have it both ways, but that's exactly what these folks try to do because, again, the truth is not on their side, so they have to misrepresent the evidence. Now, the text he was holding up was an S. Allen Greek New Testament. Now, he mentions that, there's not that, there's only... He makes it sound like it's basically relying on 2 manuscripts. I want to show you something. This is, and I hope you can see this. I'm going to hold up, and that basically he gives the list of first order texts, the most important texts for deciding the New Testament. And this is just the Gospels. I'm going to try to hold this up right over here. You see this list of all these manuscripts? This is what they use just for the Gospels. Does that look like 2 texts to you? I don't think so. Certainly, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are in there, but there's a lot of other things in there too. So no, this is simply just flat out being dishonest. You see, what King James onlyists like to do is they're very much part of the 19th century. And they sort of ignore all the manuscript discoveries of the 20th century, which were numerous. It's just complete dishonesty. They act as though back in the 19th century, the first major change was from Westcott and Hort. And their Greek New Testament used 2 manuscripts, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. The problem is that that's not what people use anymore. But they want to keep, since they use Westcott and Hort as their personal boogeymen, they want to keep acting as though that's what's really all that's being used, and it's not the case. And in fact, I'll try to show you this. I just picked a random page, and I want you to notice down here at the bottom, these are variant readings. Like this is what they think is the most accurate one, but they list all the variants under here from all the different manuscripts. You can see in there. So it's all very transparent. And they list all these manuscripts and how, which ones agree with what, and reading, etc. But none of this is mentioned. He makes it sound as though, oh, you know, they're just using these two. No, they're not. And to say they are is just flat out a lie. It's dishonest. But that's the only way someone can hold a King James onlyist position, is to either ignore the evidence and just argue it a priori, or to pretend they're using the evidence but then misrepresent it, which is dishonest, and that's what we're seeing here.
This text has 2,900 fewer words. This text is less doctrinally distinct or full. This text is not cohesive.
At this point, you just see the nonsense piling on. As for the amount of words, well, you would expect, actually, words to get added on, and that usually is, it's standard with a lot of ancient texts, is words get added on more than they get subtracted. And that's usually the way the corruption goes. So, in fact, that would actually indicate that the lengthier text is the less accurate one. But of course, he's not really aware of that. As for the text not being cohesive, or fuller, compared to there's no evidence for this. He doesn't supply any. He just states it as though it's a fact, and there really is no evidence of this whatsoever. It's no less cohesive. It's no less doctrinally distinct. The whole thing is just complete and utter nonsense. But you see, again, King James onlyists have to do this because the evidence isn't on their side. So when they pretend as though they're dealing with the evidence, they have to be dishonest. That's all they can do.
Klaus Wachtel and Barbara Allen of the Munster Institute, the primary architects of this text, say the papyri and majuscules, i.e. this type of text, are for the most part individual witnesses despite sharing general tendencies on the form of their text. They go on. They differ so widely from one another that it is impossible to establish any direct genealogical ties among them. This text did not spread widely. It's mainly an Egyptian text, mainly an Alexandrian type text.
Oh my, you really don't know where to begin with this guy. The fact is that from the text we have from the first 9 centuries of the church, the Alexandrian text was the majority text for the first 9 centuries of the church, by far. It just was. The Byzantine text doesn't start showing up the 5th, 6th century. So, in any major numbers, it doesn't really. What happens is after from the 10th century, and particularly the 11th and 12th and 13th, is when the Byzantine texts just start being churned out in huge numbers, and that's where you get it being the majority text. But in the early parts of the church, the early centuries of the church, the Alexandrian text is the dominant form of the text. So what the argument he's making here just simply does not hold water.
Bruce Metzger lists 25 heretical groups and documents that came from Alexandria. It was not a good place to get a Bible.
At this point, he's just put the pedal to the metal on just outright dishonesty. The fact is, every major city, you could find heretical groups and documents, including Antioch, including Constantinople. And when the Arian heresy, the thing that denied Christ's divinity, occurred, well, how exactly did that play out? Well, if history tells us that there was a fellow named Arius, who in fact was originally educated in Antioch, came to the church in Alexandria, started teaching this heretical doctrine, known as Arianism, that denied the divinity of Christ, and was condemned by the Alexandrian church, by the bishop there, Alexander. He then basically left, he was kicked out of Alexandria, so it obviously couldn't have been that bad a place overall. He kicked out of Alexandria and found support in Antioch. And in fact, that's where pretty much he had his base from then. And that's where at that point you have the showdown. And who is it that leads the charge against Arius? It's the Bishop of Alexandria, the fellow Alexander. And in the subsequent century, who's the main fighter against Arianism in subsequent years? It's another Bishop of Alexandria named Athanasius. As for the, quote, heretical movements and documents, you have to realize a lot of those what he's probably referring to are Gnostics, but those are outside the Alexandrian church. They were actually separate movements. They were not connected to the church in Alexandria at all. I could point to various heretical movements in Antioch and Constantinople that had no connection to either of those churches. This blatant dishonesty is what King James onlyists have to resort to because they have nothing. They have no evidence. It is a bogus position from start to finish, and all they can do when they try to handle evidence, again, is misrepresent it.
This is the fundamental Mount Impassable issue that we face. Almost all manuscripts, cohesive, doctrinally distinct, spread widely against a small number of manuscripts, not cohesive, not so doctrinally distinct, did not spread widely. This is Mount Impassable for our friends, and many friends indeed, who use the modern Bibles. I feel this must be addressed.
And as I've shown, his Mount Impassable is simply nothing but a bunch of half-truths, misconceptions, dishonesty. How can you... And at this point, I could forgive your average King James onlyist for believing this nonsense because they have no way of knowing better. But someone like Pastor Moorman has to know this stuff. He has to know this is what he's saying isn't true. There's no way he could possibly not be aware of the fact that the King James Version does not represent the majority text, that in fact it's different from it in 1800 places. There's no way he can not be aware that the Nestle-Aland text is not merely based on two manuscripts. This has all been said thousands of times. Every argument he's made has been refuted many, many times. And he has to know this. So what's his excuse?
My fourth point, truth speaks first. Truth speaks first. Beginning with the inspiration of the autographs, in each of the major epochs of how the Bible came down to us, from inspiration to our having it in our hands today, a number of important epochs, and in each of these, truth spoke first. Dissent, division, debate, corruption would follow, but in each major epoch, truth would have the first voice. I'll give you three examples. In the 850s, there was a changeover from the large-lettered unsealed text to the small-lettered minuscule text. Virtually every manuscript that went through that change was of the type that underlies our authorized version. Again, Barbara Allen and Klaus Wachtel at the Munster Institute say, they're at a loss to explain this. They say, although transferring other ancient Greek literature into the new script involved a work of criticism, this was not the case for the New Testament, at least in the sense that no attempt was made to base the newer manuscripts on the oldest available text, i.e., this kind of text. This was not an accident of history. We see the hand of God in this.
Again, there was just complete misrepresentation of what Wachtel and Allen said. They were not, quote, at a loss to explain this. They were just simply stating as fact that that there was no real attempt to go back and find the oldest manuscripts or anything. They simply copied what they had, and they're just stating as a fact. They were not saying, "Oh, I can't explain why they didn't do this." No, they didn't, because the text they had before them, and he also just simply ignores one of the major reasons, of course, being that those older texts would have been in. Since this was done around the 8th century, the 850s or so, as he said, would have been in areas already controlled by Islamic forces and outside the Byzantine Empire, which is where this would have taken place to begin with. So there was an actual reason. But he just ignores all of this because, well, frankly, he doesn't really care about the truth as much as he likes to say truth comes first. In everything he said so far, truth takes a back seat to defending the King James Bible.
A second point. In the initial printing of the Greek New Testament during the early 1500s, it does not seem to have occurred to any of those so involved to set type for any other type of text than that which underlies the authorized version. There was no debate, there was no dissent. Other manuscripts were known. They left them where they lay, but nothing approaching an Aleph B, Vaticanus Sinaiticus type of text made it within sight of the newly established publishing houses in Europe.
Again, more nonsense, and White called him on this one. First of all, when the Erasmus, Beza, Stephanus, and then finally the King James translators, when they were doing their work, there was no knowledge that there were separate text streams, text types, Western and Byzantine, and they didn't know this stuff. They had no way of dating manuscripts. They didn't really understand. None of this really meant anything to them. I mean, they didn't know this. They had texts, and they didn't have that many, as I pointed out. They worked with what they had. Yes, they knew of the existence of Vaticanus, but do you think that they necessarily the King James translators could have even had access to it, even if they had wanted it? There was no question. They didn't realize any major differences. They were simply unaware. They worked with what they had. The amount of Greek manuscripts were limited in Western Europe, and they worked with what they had. This whole idea that they even were aware of majority text, it's not. They had a dozen or so manuscripts. They worked with it. The King James translators didn't even work with that. They primarily just worked with the critical editions of Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza. So this whole argument is just bogus. It's totally bogus. And in fact, Erasmus actually did consult a friend of his who had access to Vaticanus to check on certain things like the Comma Johanneum to see if it had appeared there. But in fact, White challenged him on that point, and Moorman just avoided it. He evaded the question. He couldn't give a straight answer. And if he didn't know, then he obviously hasn't really studied the issue that much. So this is blowing smoke at this point. Okay, this video has already gone on for over an hour. So and since he really doesn't say anything of substance afterwards, I'm going to end it here. If you have any specific questions for something he says later in his presentation, feel free to ask in the comments or PM me, and I'll answer it. But I think you can. This is basically I've covered his major points, including the quote Mount Impassable. But you can see pretty much there's nothing of any substance in anything he says. As much as he tried to pretend he was interested in the Greek texts and Hebrew texts, when push came to shove, it was an a priori assumption of the King James Version as the default, and the evidence really doesn't matter. And that's pretty much what King James Onlyism is about. You know, if it comes to between King James Bible and the truth, between the readings in the King James Bible and what all the evidence points to being the correct reading, where when they differ, they just simply assume the King James Bible and the evidence be damned. Thank you very much for your time.